Last time, we basically went through the interface. We went through the basics of being able to actually control the 3D scene, and we went through the basics of polygon modeling, be able to create primitives, and then kind of use this modeling toolkit to move, rotate, and scale all of the primitives, different components, and then being able to use the smoothing to kind of smooth that out. So I want to show you some more things about polygon modeling. But before I do, there's another type of modeling. There's really three ways to model inside of Maya. There's regular polygon modeling, there's sculpting, which is typically done on polygon models, and then there's what's called NURBS modeling, N-U-R-B-S. Okay, so I've got this little cube, and I go back into my attribute editor. Now this is a polygon cube that I grabbed from the poly thing. And with the smoothing thing, we make this 10 by 10 cube, and then actually give it 10 divisions on each one. I want to hit the 3 key to see it smoothed, or 2 to see the lattice around it and the smooth. See, it makes this really nice smooth shape. And it used to be that polygons were really difficult to make smooth organic shapes like this without actually using the subdivisions to get them to be so many polygons that they became hard to manage and made rendering times really, really high. And because of that, it used to be that you would model a lot of things in polygons, but some things you would have to use NURBS, because NURBS are basically smooth shapes to begin with. They don't have any hard edges. It's kind of the opposite. It makes it harder to get hard edges. So you all understand the difference between raster and vector graphics, right? And in 2D raster, things are determined by the pixel. And then vector, things are determined by like an actual math equation. So there's no scale to it or anything. Well, it's the same thing with the difference between polygons and NURBS. Polygons are like raster graphics in the effect that they're actually defined by their individual vertices and everything that puts them together like this. NURBS are more like vector graphics, where they are represented just by a math equation to put them together. So for example, if I go here into curves and surfaces and I draw a NURBS cube, all right, I can go in, and first of all, we'll notice that there's not nearly as many nodes making up the thing in the attribute editor. So there is no specific size to make it. I can go ahead and scale it up if I want to make it bigger, but there's no way to actually change like the divisions because there really aren't any. If I go in and the modeling toolkit doesn't really affect anything, well, I guess it kind of does on NURBS. That's interesting. But we'll use the right-click menu to really talk about it briefly, that instead of having vertex, face, and edges, they have what they'll call their control vertex. I'll show you these first. You can see that the control vertex is not actually the edges like you would expect, but it's just like a whole grid over top of here. Oops. If I right-click, if I select control vertex, I can actually pick on one and move it. You can see that it's actually, there's not a lot of resolution there, but it's actually making some curvature, all right? It's not just one point being pulled up like we would expect on a traditional polygon model. Might be a little easier to show on a sphere, I should say. Let me go back to object mode, getting rid of these individual faces, isoparms. So if I go to a sphere, zoom in on it. In fact, let me put a NURBS sphere next to a polygon sphere so you can see the difference. Now, right away with a polygon sphere, without smoothing, you can see that there's some like edges to it, right? This is all defined by these points. And if I go in, if I right-click and choose, stop that, I choose vertex, each of these individual pieces, they're gonna just stick out like a jagged edge unless I were to actually use the smoothing. All right, now NURBS work a little differently, where if I choose the control vertex, you can see that they're most of the time, they're not even actually on the surface. They're outside of the surface. And this is what traditionally made them allowed to have these curved surfaces. And if I move things out, see, it doesn't treat it like a vertex. It treats it more like this control point that has a weight attribute that will move things around. All right, so it's a lot easier to kind of keep organic shapes without having to smooth with NURBS. Another big thing with NURBS here, oops. So anyway, control vertex is synonymous with a vertex and polygons. Isoparm is synonymous with an edge. So I can grab, or actually can't grab, and I can add individual little isoparms to add shape. And then a hull, I believe, is synonymous, or no, the hull's the outside. Surface patch, synonymous with a actual face. So they just have different nomenclature, different pieces to put them together, and ultimately there's a reason why most people use all polygons now, because their tool set is just much larger, they're much easier to work with. Again, it's interesting to understand why these are in here, because for a long time it was way too hard to get nice smooth models inside, with polygons without defining them too much. But now that we have this built-in smoothing algorithm that works with all the renderers, it really revolutionized that. Now, if we were working in an orthogonal view, like a top view, for example, maybe we wanted to create some kind of like piece of some stamp or something. There's a lot of curve and surface tools. Now, if we're in the polygon modeling, we can actually draw a polygon. I don't know if it's in here, but somewhere in all these edit mesh tools, we can project curves. I'm not even going to really get to it, but at some level, you can draw vertices in 2D and connect them until they actually make a shape. That's not usually best practice for modeling, because you want all of your polygons to be four-sided. So that's why most people usually start with just a primitive and use box modeling to start creating things. There's a little different way to model using NURBS, where you can start with 2D shapes and you use these different curves and surfaces. So if I take this 3-point curve tool, for example, there's a bunch of different ways to make curves. And what we're seeing here, besides the poly modeling shelf, I'm clicking on this curve surfaces shelf. Actually, I'll come back and show you all these in the drop downs for a minute. For the top view, I can actually click on 3 different things and it makes a nice curve for me. It gives me this insane radius right now. But now if I look in these 3 different views, go around on my view, I actually have a 2D curve that I can draw in 2D space. And there's a whole set of modeling techniques where I could draw like a curve like this, and then maybe I could draw maybe perpendicular to that in the front view, draw this circle. I guess I'll rotate it into being perpendicular-ish. There we go. Kind of move it into position over here somewhere. And there's all of these tools that are used to take 2D shapes and create 3D objects out of them. All right, so there's like this revolve tool. Usually I can, for example, select. It's usually about shift selecting 2 different pieces and then using one of these tools. Maybe I select it in the other order. Yeah, it's still just revolving around that. Maybe we want to lathe this one. Okay, there we go. So now I just made a 3D shape by saying, okay, take this circle and follow it along that path. And all of a sudden, I have this little freaky tube that I made. All right, now you can do that with NURBS and create all kinds of shapes and piece them together. But again, traditionally, they were made to make smooth shapes and characters, but now polygons are just overwhelmingly what people use, because there's all kinds of issues with like seaming these together. But you may find out there certain tutorials and things, you may find people using curves and surfaces for kind of outlying reasons. But just if you were to start going through and learning modeling in Maya, it can be a little confusing with these different sets. And I'm not really going to go any deeper with it with NURBS, because there's really no reason to use them in this class. We can use polygon modeling and smoothing and box modeling for everything we're going to do. It's really the fastest way to get the best results. But I did want to at least point out that this whole tool sets with all of these curves and surfaces is just a different type of modeling that for the most part you want to stay away from. But it does have, if you want to look in and watch a couple of videos on NURBS modeling or NURBS versus polygon modeling, you'll see some pros and cons, but you'll find overwhelmingly that pretty much people use polygons now. Looking at the tool sets up top, so again, under create, you can either start with creating NURBS primitives or polygon primitives or whatever. Throw this cube on there so we've got something to look at. Now, coming across, I've explained before that each of these drop downs are the same up through Windows, and then all of a sudden over to the right is going to depend on what set you're using here. So if you're on animation, it'll have a bunch of animation tools. Now on modeling, I'm also going to open this modeling toolkit, because once again, I'm going to show you a couple other little things, but you're pretty much going to have the tools in your belt that you're going to need to just model whatever you want. So maybe I'll take this primitive and you could just save it. So every time I draw one, it's not the default. If I were to go and create cube, maybe I'll do this. And how about each one of them I want to be 10 by 10. Create that, and then maybe in the attribute editor here, I can go, whoops, that was a NURBS cube, so I wouldn't let me do that. Great, polygon primitives, cube. There we go. So now I want it to be 10. Well, I'll leave this one by one actually. 1, 1, 1. Give it 10 divisions though. All right, so now move out of the way. Zoom in a bit, and now when we see the different smoothings on the different levels of detail there. All right, now first off, when we start doing, there's one window I forgot to show you guys, is this one that you can click on by this little thing right here. Is called the outliner. And this is something that I usually have open. I'll usually have one, like you can switch between different 4-up views and things like that, but I personally usually have just a perspective view, and I'm constantly moving around it with my Alt and 3 buttons like this. I've usually either the attribute editor or one of these 3 open, basically. I usually don't use the modeling toolkit personally. You can just to see the visuals, but I'm usually using like the right-click menu if I'm doing something. I'll usually have the attribute editor open. But this outliner over here, this allows you to actually name your objects and keep track of stuff and keep track what's in the scene. So let's take a step back for a moment. Before we start like looking at new tools, what is the first thing that you should do when you open up Maya and start working? One of the biggest things in Maya is to make sure that your project, you use the set project and project window down here to make sure that you're working in a particular project. I just open my project window and it shows that I'm working in the default project, which I do not want to be. I want to actually create one. So I'm going to go in again and just in the project window, I'll do create new. So if I create this and then I want to stick it on my desktop, except you can't see it because it's on another screen, but it's automatically creating this Maya Summer 2 2020 folder. And now that I did that, now if I go look at my project window, now it's showing me that that's the current project, that's the desktop. And actually, if I drag my Finder window over, you can see it automatically made all of these folders and everything. So it's really, really important that we start at that point. So now that I'm in here, I've got these couple of cubes. If I were to save my scene, more modeling tools, maybe Boolean would be one, for example, as a way to make some interesting shapes. Maybe I'll save a scene as that. Goes right into the scenes folder of this. Again, the student version is always going to pop up when this happens. Okay, so anyway, now that we've got this and we have our project set, this outliner window is really important to understand that this is how you basically keep track of what's in your scene. I have this NURBS cube, which I guess was the first one I drew. I meant to do the polygon cube. I'm just going to delete that. I'm sitting on top of it. I've got polygon cube 1, 2, and 3. Looks like I've got 2 of them on top of each other. I'm going to delete that, which I was messing with earlier. But before we draw anything, in fact, I'm just going to start from scratch. Instead, I'm going to just do a new scene. Don't save. Keeps me in my project. I've got this fresh scene. Now I'm going to go save scene as, over and save it as Boolean. Okay. So now, go back on poly modeling. Drew my cube. I remembered the presets this time and gave it 10 things all around. Great. Now, before I even drew that, you can see that it comes with 4 different cameras, your perspective, top, front, and side. That's what you see in the 4-up view. And then it has what's called a default light set and a default object set. We get into lighting, you'll see that we actually need to add lights into our scene and things. But for right now, we're just worried about our models. And this lets you track things. So I can, you can see it's named pcube1. That's this very first node. It's called the transform node. That's what holds its name when I'm looking at the attribute editor. It's even here in the channel editor. In either place, I can edit it. So if I'm in the channel editor here and I change that to pcube1, let's call it awesome square. Okay, so now, okay, let's be technical about it and call it awesome cube. Okay, so now this is named awesome cube, and you can see it updated in the outliner over here. And if I look at the attribute editor, Now all of these things, awesome cube shape, then we get into the other nodes, other cube, whatnot. If I move awesome cube out of the way and I want to draw torus, okay, it just says P torus 1. Again, in any of these places, you can change the name. It'll update in all of them. So if I double click here in the outliner and I can change it to badass torus. You have an awesome cube and a badass torus, and now that updates everything in here. So it doesn't seem as big of a deal when you're just working on a couple of little shapes, but when you start having a complex scene, using the outliner over here is absolutely imperative to know what's in your scene, and then even to be able to create hierarchies, grouping things together and parenting things and stuff like that. So now there are so many windows inside of Maya. So far, really all we've looked at is what you can get to just from the default interface by clicking some of these buttons to get things around, hiding and showing some of these tabs over here. If you ever like lose something and can't find it, or it's very easy to customize the interface if you accidentally pull off a panel or something, this Windows drop down up here. First of all, you can customize your workspaces just like other programs. You can choose from a whole bunch of individual ones, whether you're, so let's go to modeling expert. Okay, if we're at modeling expert, we don't have most of these panels. It just kicks us off to this huge thing. It's showing us our viewport settings on the top, and that's it. So we could use our right-click menu to do a lot of things, or we could use that space bar to pull up that whole ghost menu system of everything. Or modeling standard, that's kind of close, breaks a few things down, gives us our modeling toolkit and our attribute editor and 2 tabs. That's kind of cool. So just like most, you know, software programs, there's a ton of different workspaces, but you know, some might look totally different in Maya. Like if we're going to animation, there's just a lot of different things to look at and get to. I'm going to go back just to the Maya Classic view, okay, which I have this outliner turned on. But what you can look at is outside of the workspaces, once you get into editors, under general editors, a lot of these near the top, the attribute editor, channel box, we'll come back to the content browser. The tool settings, these are all the ones that we're seeing that are all major. So everything you can get to, you can find in these windows. So if you lose something, you can probably find it. Like, crap, I lost my attribute editor. Well, you can get it, you find it, click here, and it'll make it pop up. All right, so let's go back to this modeling toolkit and just show you a couple of things. Now, all you really need is to be able to create these primitives and then use the components to be able to move, rotate, scale things around, and be able to smooth stuff. Doing that, you can pretty much model anything. You can certainly model anything that would be expected, you know, basic within this class. Now there are a ton. Now that's the best way, the simplest box modeling technique. You can look up videos on Maya box modeling, and basically with using those tools, using some of the extrude and stuff. Oops, do that, object mode there. You can do pretty much anything, but there are a ton of tools. If we go over here under mesh, most of these tools, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to go through a couple of them that are used a lot inside of the modeling toolkit, which is why they're in the toolkit. But really, all 3 of these, plus even the display ones, these are all part of Maya's modeling toolkit for polygon models. The stuff under mesh, this has to do with basically entire objects. So being able to separate and combine, I'll deal with over here, but poking holes, filling holes in, remesh and retopologize, these are actually new tools to 2020. You can look a little deeper into those, but those can save you a lot of time when you're like UVing, or when you need to, when you're working on a complicated model and you need to just in one stretch kind of organize and even out all the faces, which can be a very time-consuming manual process without this remesh. But that's with real heavy, complicated stuff. We probably won't need to get anything too that detailed into this. Edit mesh. This has all these tools that are really based for, you can see under the components, vertex, edge, face. They're kind of grouped into the ways that that you might use them. But everything from like beveling sides to bridging faces together to flipping to chamfering vertices, and there's all kinds of little modeling techniques and tools to play with. Whoops, I just pulled it off. You can do that by accident all the time. Mesh tools, Again, just different tools that didn't really fit in either of the others. I'm going to show you some of the painting stuff. Here's where you can actually create a polygon and draw in 2D. Any of these tools, you'll notice almost all of them, again, almost all of them have this little tool setting box next to it. So circularize is a tool that goes, but we can play with the settings and go ahead and try it out. So what if we circularize this? Well, I just blew it up, it's disappeared from the screen. I'll undo that. So again, we're not going to get into the details of most of these tools, but do feel free to click through, play with them, see what they just kind of do. Or, the Maya help is extremely helpful and organized to go through things in more detail. I'm really trying to give you a very quick overview and trying to point out specifically the tools that you should be using to get the most out of doing something in a short amount of time. But even inside of modeling, you can see, all right, NURBS, we'll talk about UVs, I'm going to talk about sculpting here in a moment. But if I just extend polygon modeling, it'll give a quick little overview, but then it'll very quickly get into all of the different tools that we can use. So editing polygons, anyway, it looks like it's pretty link heavy. But if there's a specific tool that you want to get to, like the crease tool, okay, this is a good one. I'll actually show you this. This is really useful. This will allow you to, well, the moral of the story is if you go through the help on any specific tool, then it's a little easier for you to kind of get the details of what it's doing. Sometimes that's necessary to read through before you just start willy-nilly playing with something. But let me show you what this crease tool does, because this is really useful. If I'm going to draw let's create a polygon primitive cube that only has, let's say, like 2 divisions instead of 10. And a lot of what you're going to be doing is, again, we're going to expect all of these models to be smooth at some level. So, you can see that more density gives you more of a defined shape. Less density gives you more rounded objects. And you kind of have to find that happy medium again to have enough density where your modeling isn't too dense, but not too much. So it doesn't smooth well. But what the crease tool does is if I smooth this out, or actually I'll do it in the middle, leave it on 2 so you can see both. If I go find this, is it under edit mesh? No, it's under mesh tools. Where is the crease? There it is, crease tool. I'm not even going to look at the options right now. I'm just going to click it. And it actually tries to tell me, it says select components to increase, then drag the middle mouse button. There goes that middle mouse button again. So just by kind of hovering over, I'm seeing it's trying to get me to grab these edges. So I'm going to select this edge, shift select that second edge. And now I'm going to use my middle mouse button to drag. And sure enough, I can see the effect or the force of that crease with my middle mouse button. And the middle mouse button a lot of times will just give you an interactive view. You don't necessarily have to use it. I'll show you that in a moment. But once I've done that, I can get back out of the tool, click the selection tool, maybe right click, go back to object mode. And now I'll go straight up to, if I click on one, my box hasn't changed, still looks the same, but I can see a heavier edge there. You see that's highlighted a little bit heavier? All right, so you see the edge is a little heavier to show you the crease. But now if I hit 3 to actually see the smooth version and click away from it, you can see that actually goes. You can't see it very good because there's flat lighting right now, but if this had better lighting, you'd be able to see that this goes to a sharp point, all right? And sometimes that's something you want to do is based on your level of smoothing. There may be certain edges and areas that you want to crease out and smoothen less, a little bit like this. Now, when I select this object, if I go into the attribute editor, you can see it still only has a P cube here. Looks like this time editor was added, probably because I accidentally clicked on the animation thing. Don't need that right now. But if I click on this polycube, again, it's important to know that when you're looking at the attribute editor, Maya is made up of a series of nodes that make up the object. And each of these nodes will have its different attributes. So this polycube is just one simple, so I'll call it crease box is the name of our polycube now. And the very first node, all the way to the left, the furthest one downstream, this is the transform node, which has its name and has where it is in space. Right now it's at 0, 0, 0, rotated, scaled, all this good stuff. Then we have what's called the shape node. And this is where you can control all kinds of things about the mesh, which we don't really go into, component display and render stats and all kinds of stuff. Then we have a crease node. If I go past the crease node, we'll come back to that, back to the polycube. This is where we can affect the width and height and the actual number of subdivisions and stuff. If you keep going over, you'll see there's a shading group, and then there's actually a texture. And we'll get into all of that when we get into doing shading and textures. But this is an example of all these nodes that are put together to make this shape. Well, what I'm pointing out here is that when we added that crease tool, it actually created a crease node. Before I made that crease, this wasn't here. And now that this is in here, I can click it, and in case I didn't have a right mouse button, I can go in here, and this is kind of a list of each different edge that I selected. And now I could go in, if I set these to 0, it's gonna bring that crease. So I set one of those edges to 0 and the other one's back up to 3.33. In fact, I'm guessing if I set this to 1, that might be a full crease. No, that's only a partial crease. So I'm not sure what it probably depends on your size of your model, that the scale of this thing is only 1, 1, 1. If it were like 10 high, then, you know, creasing it a value of 3 or 4 might not do anything, and it might need to be 30 or 40. Let's see if we increase this value to 10. Looks like that's about as high as it needs to go, but that creases it back out, all right? So that's just one example of one of the modeling toolkit things that isn't right here that I think is really useful to create the crease tool, because it's just really powerful to be able to go in and out of the smooth mode. But there's some situations where you need, you know, more smoothing or less smoothing than more without having to create a whole bunch of extra mesh. The key is to have the least amount of mesh as possible to get the most complicated shape. Because as soon as you start adding more and more mesh, then it becomes much more difficult to actually affect it. All right, so a couple of other ones on here. If I just kick a torus out here, drag it out of the way, you can combine and separate meshes. You can also group them together in the outliner, which I'll kind of go over a different time. But let's get this back into regular, this is one key, non-smooth mode. Right now, these are two separate meshes with two separate names. If I shift selected them and combine them, now all of a sudden, it keeps their history, so to speak. So you could click the individual nodes and actually go edit them. Just something I'll talk about in another class is history and deleting that. But now we have this new thing, which is I'll call it two shapes. That is the name of our new object. And now these are treated as one object together. All right, so that can be very useful to group things together like that. You can go the other way also. If I undo back to before I combined those, undid before I even moved that, move this back out of the way. And let's say I just want to separate a part of this. So if I were to go in and choose a face, for example, or actually, maybe I'll region drag and just try and select half the cube. All right, so I'm looking around, looks like I got all those faces. Well, in theory, I should be able to separate this. No, okay, I can't break apart a primitive like that. But if I were to have previously combined two objects, then I could separate them again by using separate. So not a big deal. I showed you guys smooth last time, how you can add a ton of detail to a specific, you know, either to the entire object or to a specific spot. But you really want to try and stay away from that as much as you can unless it's absolutely necessary, because we want to, like object mode, let's undo this. Because we just use the built-in smoothing with the 1, 2, and 3, which really does the same thing, but it keeps this lower level of detail level that you can play with. Boolean operations, that's what this is. If I have two primitives or two objects in any way, shape, or form that are actually intersecting each other, like this, a Boolean operation is something that lets you take two different shapes and combine them into one shape, but in a particular mathematical way to account for the intersection. I'll show you what I mean. So I can click on Boolean here. Whoops, it's warning me. This is good. A lot of times you'll try and use a tool and it'll say, hey, you need something. So it says must have at least 2 polygon meshes selected. So I made this mistake of hitting the tool before I made the selection. A lot of tools in Maya work that way, where you'll have to make a selection in a particular way, select 2, sometimes up to 3 items before the tool will actually function. In this case, I'm going to select the torus first, then shift select the box. It'll always keep the most recent selection in green and any subsequent selections in white like this. And now if I click on Boolean, all right, it gives me this operation that I can play with of either union, which is going to give me basically a combination of both of them stuck together. If I were to go inside of this object, you could see that there's actually a hole cut. And it's actually an interesting way. Like we could put a light in here, and now we've got this interesting, weird little room, right? Like putting objects together or using primitives. You don't always have to think about looking at them from the outside. You can use them from the inside as well to be able to create, environments and everything pretty quickly by, taking a couple walls off of a cube and sticking all your stuff inside of it. So union puts the two together. Difference will take basically whatever was not, or the difference between the two based on which one was selected first. So because I selected the torus first, it cut this little piece out. If I had selected the other one first, it would have cut a piece out of the box where the torus was going in. Or intersection will leave just the piece left over that had the two together. So you've had 3D, you've probably seen that before, but that's a pretty common thing. Again, used to be a little bit, it's a really quick and easy way to poke holes in things, which can be a little hard to do as far as just the traditional box modeling technique, because traditional box modeling, you're always just trying to keep these contiguous edges. But sometimes if you just want to, poke a hole through something or get some interesting shapes really quickly, you can take two shapes and kind of combine them together with Booleans. So combine and separate is kind of self-explanatory. Smooth, we talked about. Boolean. Extrude we went through last time. I'm not going to go through bridge, bevel, and add divisions. Add divisions kind of similar to smooth. You can look these up in more detail if you want. Extrude is really the one that makes the biggest difference with box modeling because that's the one that you want to select your individual edges, faces, and as you extrude, that's how you can actually add stuff to the model, actually add clay to it rather than just moving something around. So it's very, very, very powerful. These tools, I'm not going to really mess with these. Multi-cut, target weld, quad draw. You can, in theory, actually start in 2D with polygons. If I were to change this to the orthographic views, here I'm just going to delete all of these things I keep drawing. I can use the quad draw tool, and I can actually, it requires a live surface or selected mesh. Oh, okay, so let's try a quad on an actual mesh. Okay, that's new. So maybe I wanted to draw a actual piece. Okay, I'm not gonna really get into that because, there's a reason I don't want to spend too much time on a lot of these detailed modeling tools, because for a lot of things actually, you can build almost anything just using basic box modeling, pushing and pulling components, and using the smoothing that we're using. All of these other tools that we get into, components tools, all this stuff under edit mesh tools, they're all very fine-tuned details, but certainly if modeling is your thing and it all is coming very smoothly and you feel like you want a larger tool set, certainly spend some time looking through some of these other tools as well. Let me show you soft selection. That's something that's in here, symmetry and soft selection really, which is pretty interesting. So let's start again with a cube, go back to just the perspective view. In this polycube, here, let's blow this up to be 10 in every direction. And then I'll even give it 10 subdivisions. Zoom out so we can see the thing. Okay, so with the modeling toolkit open, symmetry is cool. Let's say if I select vertices, and maybe I turn symmetry on, and I can choose which axis, either the world X, Y, and Z, or the object X, Y, and Z. Let's choose the object Y, for example. And now object Y symmetry is on. When I choose, you can see that even as I'm going to try and selecting them, let's change this to object X. There we go. You can see that the selection is mirroring what's on the other side. All right, and that can be really a common modeling technique if you're modeling a face, for example, and trying to model an eye on one side and, select your vertices and put little indents in there, and it'll do them both at once. So symmetry is pretty important and cool. Camera-based selection, we're not going to mess with that because we haven't set up any cameras yet. You can actually change your type of selecting. By default, it's pick or marquee, meaning drag a selection around. You can change it to drag. So for example, if you were on a face, it might be a little easier. Let me turn symmetry back off so it's not so chaotic. It might be easier to like click and drag across faces like this to select them rather than having to click each individual one and hold shift to do it. So there's some of that to play with. And then also highlighting back faces and nearest components you can play with if you find yourself accidentally selecting stuff on the back if you didn't want. So let me show you soft selection, because soft selection is a really cool way to model kind of a complicated polygon mesh. It's kind of an in-between sculpting and actually component wrangling. I'm going to show you the 3 levels of those. So component wrangling is what we've seen so far. So even if we click multi-component, if I'm on the move tool and just want to move stuff around, sure, I select a vertex and it's just grabbing that one particular vertex and it's like a single point. Again, that'll smooth out if I'm working in the smooth mode, but it's still, you know, it's just limited to I'm only moving the selection that I made, right? Go back here, undo that, and point back up. Same thing with a face. Sure, maybe I can turn it on, it's on drag. Maybe I can drag and select a few random faces. When I go to move those, they're gonna move a bigger chunk, whether I'm extracting them, but they're still moving only the faces. Everything around it is just being stuck and like stretching where it needs to. What soft selection does is it allows you to have kind of a fall off from your selection, which is really, really cool. So let's see how it's worked to set up in this panel. So if I turn soft selection on, okay, perfect. So soft selection really has to do with the size of your object. So for example, I have my object is 10 by 10 by 10. The specific scale is going to be real important that everyone builds to. And this soft select, which you can turn off, when I have it selected right now, it's set to volume and at 5. Because it's set at 5, you can see it's taking up almost half the thing with the fall off. If I set this, let's bring this maybe down to 2. Whoops, there we go. Put this back on the main thing, select it, there we go. Whoops, going back and forth between these 2 things. Okay, so now you can see the fall off is a little bit different. Actually, let's try 3. I think that'll be a nice happy medium here. So what I can do now is even not in the smooth version, if I choose vertex and up at the top, instead of just moving one, now when I move it, it's going to have a fall off and affect the others around it. In fact, this will help if that sticks at 3 for me. I'm going to hit enter. There we go. Okay, so now if I select a single vertex, instead of moving that single vertex out, it's going to have this fall off and affect all the vertices around it. All right, so this is a really powerful tool to be able to do some like curvature within a box as you're moving things around. So maybe I'll choose face, and if I were to select, you know, hold shift and keep selecting faces, you know, at some point, and the fall off will even go kind of around the corner. And notice how, see that whole edge is bending like this. And I'm still in like the non-smooth mode. Like ideally you can model as close as you can in this non-smooth mode. And then when you go to smooth, now all of a sudden you're gonna see your nice smooth mesh. But the point is you wanna have like your non-smooth model still look pretty close, but just have the kind of polygon edges. And then your smooth model is what allows you to get that nice smoothing all the way out. But instead of having to deal with these individual small components with a somewhat complicated mesh, you can use soft selection to just grab major parts of it and have this fall off to really affect some nice organic shapes. So you can, of course, change the curve, whether it's the volume or the surface that you're dealing with. So volume is default, which will do the whole shape. But you can change the fall off, and you can even change like the curvature of the fall off. All kinds of things you can play with that isn't, you know, really necessary. Just understanding that this soft selection using any of the tools, including scale and rotate. So if I want to rotate this shape or this face, let's choose an edge. I'm going to rotate an edge here. You know, it's going to affect all those edges around it. And that's just really, really powerful when you first start modeling and start pushing and pulling and moving and translating things around. Having a little bit of soft selection goes a long way. And then I believe with soft selection, yeah, there we go. There we go. The B key for brush. When you have soft selection turned on and you have a selection, for example, let's go back to vertice. I'll choose a single vertice. I'm going to go back to the move tool. As I hold the B key on my keyboard, I can then click and drag, and you can see that I can interactively change the fall off area. All right, so if I let go over here, you can see it's going to change this. Okay, it's 1.93. If I want to change like half the cube, I'll bring it up. You can still rotate around. Again, hold the B key, click and drag. And because I have that soft selection on, it's going to interactively show me how much it's going to affect. And then I can let go, and now I can move around my thing and see that fall off actually affecting. So I'm just sitting here messing around with a stupid cube, and I go back to object mode. And again, the number 1 key gives me this interesting shape, but with the 3 key on, I can see I have a nice smooth shape with smooth edges. I can use the crease tool if I want to harden any particular edge. And this is what you use. So between creating primitives, creating some reasonable amount of density without being too much, using the smoothing, and using soft selection, very, very powerful. You can also double click on any of these. Soft selection has more tools. This modeling toolkit is really a subset of the tools you can find in the drop downs. The tools you can find in the panels also are kind of a subset of the drop down. And this just tries to group together everything that is just, a lot of people use with box modeling all together at once. But if you want more detail with the soft selection, besides just the regular fall off, you can go into it by double clicking any of these move, rotate, or scale tools, and then going to the soft selection drop down within it. And you'll see that these will be synonymous. So if I turn soft selection on for any tool, it will turn it on or off for all the tools, including over here. But besides just playing with the fall off radius and you can play with the interpolation, and you can totally just get a bunch of crazy presets of these different things to shoot over there, all right? And then you can even change the fall off colors if you're not happy with the way that looks. You can do quite a bit of customization, and that soft selection gives you some powerful, powerful, powerful tools to nudge around elements in your mesh, when you have a little too much topology. But again, be warned, when you're starting out, it's best to start with less detail in your box or whatever shapes you're starting with. Again, a lot of people just start off with a cube, and then you just add detail as you go, extrude as you go. I would recommend watching a couple of short YouTube videos on box modeling in Maya, and you'll be able to see how people create a bunch of different types of objects, just starting with a cube and adding stuff where you need. But it's definitely an art form to have enough detail to be able to make shapes, but not too much detail. And going back and forth between the smoothing without having to smooth your base mesh, and using soft selection when you have enough base mesh that it's getting, when you want to move major parts of it and not small details, those tools can go a long way to manipulate your little virtual clay here. So 3 types of modeling in Maya. Polygon modeling, which is by far the most used, what we've seen, what I've showed you with all this box modeling technique, all this multi-component toolkits, the soft selection, all of that is on polygon modeling, the smoothing. NURBS modeling, I kind of explained briefly, kind of outdated, but is made for smooth shapes, and there are some people that use them in certain situations. Feel free to look up pros and cons. The other thing we can do is we can sculpt models, and you can see the sculpting panel has these different sculpting tools. I'm going to go back and start again with a big cube, but the issue with sculpting is you have to have a big, dense enough mesh to actually sculpt on. All right, so if I just straight up draw a little cube, and it's a little like this, and I zoom in on it, I try and use a sculpting tool, okay, it's just not really going to do much. It's just kind of like pushing my thing around. It's really not meant for small little things like this. What it's meant for is if I have a box that I'm going to make, how about instead of my polygon primitives, and you notice on purpose I keep creating these things in different ways. Sometimes I'll go here and click it, sometimes I'll do this. create polygon primitive cube. I'm going to hit the little tools next to the cube, and this time I'm going to make one that is 100 by 100 on every side, and I'm even going to go with 100 divisions, which might blow up, but we'll see what happens when I hit create. Way inside of it, the zoom way out. All right, and this is now a dense mesh, okay? Like you can imagine that if I were to go in and want to use the components, you know, just pulling without soft selection on, just pulling an individual vertice or even individual faces would be a bit of a nightmare and would take a long time to model, you know, anything really of detail. So this is where you could see like the less detail to be able to still get some realistic smoothing without having it, oh, I'm not going to smooth this because it's going to blow up my computer if I try. But again, it's that happy medium between having enough that your smoothing doesn't just smooth into a sphere, so you have some definition, but you don't have too much definition, so it's hard to work with. But when you get into too much definition, soft selection is helpful. So you can see just leaving this at 8.5. Again, I can hold the B key to kind of change my effect area. And now if I were to try and move that one vertice, okay, you can see I picked this weird sine wave thing. So now my soft selection is using this strange sine wave, which makes a pretty cool effect. But if I were to undo that, go back into my soft selection settings and set this back to a normal curve. Okay, now when I make my selection, now it'll pull out as you could expect. Sure, I could still play with my B key and make it much larger, and I could somewhat, you know, control this as a massive object, but it just becomes, you know, a little difficult to deal with detail. So if I wanted to go with detail, I'm just gonna undo things sticking out here, turn soft selection back off, and go back into object mode, by clicking object mode. Now I can use these sculpting tools. Now these sculpting tools, there's a dozen or more of them inside of Maya like this. In fact, there's a nice place, I'll open this up again real quickly. If we go into the help menu, and if you do go under, just because this one in particular is laid out really nicely, if you go under modeling and then sculpting, you can look at the actual sculpting tools and it will tell you individually what kind of hotkeys to get into them and stuff. But there's just a lot of different tools and what they can do. There's a lot in here and it's a whole subset in of itself, pretty powerful, where I choose this tool and right away it's going to turn my live object this gray color. And once again, I can still hold Alt to constantly like look around and get around things. But I've got this little area where I'm going to sculpt, and I can click and I can start sculpting, and it's going to draw up this particular shape as I sculpt on it. Control goes the other way, and then Shift kind of relaxes out the effect you've already put in. And there's a lot of different tools that will sculpt in different ways and make different types of things. I can also, right now I'm using the crease one, and any of these that you roll over, you'll see at the very bottom, it says lift a surface. There's a couple smooth ones, pull in a single vertice, sharpen edges. Then you can get into like actual stamps and stuff. You click on the stamp tool and you can load objects or images that based on their opacity. You can kind of stamp out stuff and, you know, very quickly make a little mountain range. You know, primitives may seem like silly and simple at first, but if you get enough detail, you use these, you know, things and put a camera in here, and all of a sudden I have this mountain range background and stick my little character down here. But anyway, this sculpting is a way to take these brushes, and once again, you can hold the B key and adjust the size of your brush stroke that you're going to be sculpting. Quite a few tools in here to be able to sculpt really high level meshes. All right, to just very, very easily put on some, like, you know, sculpt some scratches on an object, or if you're doing a character's face, put some imperfections by getting a nice noise brush and just subtly putting some little pock marks and things like that. Or you can sculpt actual, you know, landscapes and things like that. But this is all polygon modeling. It's just be aware that that box modeling and sculpting are typically two completely different things. That box modeling is based on the idea that you want to start with as simple of a model as possible. and you'll smooth it, and you'll continuously work on adding detail where and only where you need it. And that has the advantage of being able to model a little quicker to quickly rough out shapes. And it also, when it comes time to render, will have the least number of polygons to render faster. And when you're adding things to game engines, polygons count and all of this stuff. When you get into smoothing, you're typically dealing with like a really dense mesh, something that has already probably been box modeled and perfected. And then you may go into, sorry, not smoothing, sculpting. You may go into sculpting to add some like fine details. A lot of times when you're sculpting a model, it's really meant to be a very high-res version, whether it's for like, really powerful game engine or just for actual animation and stuff. So the sculpting tools are not hidden very far. They're sitting here right next to the polygon tools. You can learn more about them. But that's just another tool in your tool set that you guys don't necessarily need to get into. But those are the three major levels: sculpting, NURBS, and polygon. And you can sculpt NURBS also, so that kind of works on both of them. Once again, just as a quick little review, between creating these primitives, being able to control their size and their divisions through the attribute editor or through the actual object tool settings options before you create things, just piecing the things together like Legos like that, using the components, whether you use the modeling toolkit or you can right click on in this tool right now. So the right click menu is always context sensitive and may show you different things based on different tools. So I can exit sculpting and all that. I'm going to go back into my selection tool here. You guys remember me showing you how this always shows you the most recently used tool. But anyway, you can right click and choose the different things, move, rotate, and scale things around. 1, 2, and 3 for smoothing. Using soft selection can go a long way with being able to model more complex parts of your model without having to select specific individual vertices and spaces and things like that. Extrude is used pretty heavily to kind of add to the model without having to create a new primitive and combine them somehow. It's usually best to kind of just take a piece of it and extrude it out, because ultimately you're wanting to keep all of these polygons, these nice quads, these nice four-sided polygons, no matter how you end up misshaping them. The remesh and retopologize, those are tools that when you get really heavy into modeling can be useful for you to kind of take your final model and even out all the surfaces so the UVs spread over it nicely and things animate without kind of creasing and pinching all over the place. So that, my friends, is pretty much what we're going to go through in modeling. From here, I'll get into lighting, we'll get into texturing these models, animating, rendering. Each of these major sections, I'll show you the basics and show you the tools that are the most widely used and the best to get the quickest results. And I'll show you kind of where to find more detailed tools as we get into it.